Let's crank a sock today. To make a sock that has a contrasting short row heel, contrasting short row toe, and I also did a hung hem with contrasting color as well. Hey there, I am Felicia from SweetGeorgia Yarns and the School of SweetGeorgia, and today I want to crank a sock with the latest colorway from our Secret Stash Club yarn subscription box. Now, this month's colorway I have here in a skein format, and I also wound into a cone. And so this month's colorway is called Lightning Rod for the reason that when I cranked the sample, the hand-painted colors that were in this skein aligned into this spiral of shocking colors that just ripped right through the sock. I loved it. So I cranked the sock the same way that I always do, just one cone of yarn, one color all the way through. But after cranking the sock, I thought it would be extra fun if we added a mini skein of contrasting colors so that you could use this for contrasting heels, toes, cuffs, if you like. So this yarn is our SweetGeorgia Tough Love sock, which is always wonderful for knitting socks. And so I'm going to be knitting this with my Erlbacher Speedster circular sock knitting machine, also known as a CSM. So this cylinder has become my go-to size for cranking socks that will fit my feet. Now, occasionally I will swap out the cylinder to crank different size tubes for different purposes, but for the most part, this cylinder lives on my machine. Now, to get started, my plan is to crank a hung hem stockinette sock with a short row heel and toe. So I can start the contrasting color for the hung hem, and then I switch to the main color for the leg. Then I'm going to crank the heel with this contrasting color, and then I'm going to go back to the main color for the foot and then switch back to the contrasting color for the short row toe. There are lots of different ways that you can change colors on a circular sock knitting machine, but one of the ways that I want to show you is a technique that is sometimes called clasped weft or Faux Russian Join. And so part of that is that you're taking your contrast color and your main color and you kind of loop the two together in this way. Each end is folded and you're going to crank a little bit with this doubled up yarn. And so this allows there to be a join in the middle here where the yarns are folded together, and then you don't actually have to weave in any ends at the end of the process. So the whole point of this join process is that you don't have to actually weave in any ends with a needle. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I am going to put my sock bonnet on here. This is my cast on bonnet so that I can cast on my stitches. I have a bit of waste yarn that I have saved from previous projects. I'm just reusing this waste yarn. I'm just going to crank forward to cast on my stitches. Okay, so I'm going to stop my carrier here at my 3 o'clock mark. This is my 3 o'clock mark, this is my 6 o'clock mark, this is my 9 o'clock mark, and this is my 12 o'clock mark. And so I always start all of my rounds right here at this corner here. Now I'm going to take my contrasting color yarn and I'm going to use this for the hung hem. And then if you can see, I am laying in my project yarn and now I'm laying in my project yarn, and you can see that my waste yarn and my project yarn, they both wrap around behind this needle number 1. And so that allows the two yarns to be knit together without causing a bit of a hole. Now I'm going to hold down on all of my stitches and crank around. And then what I do is I actually engage my heel spring because I like knitting with my heel spring on. So I reset the counter to 0, and that's round number 1, and then I crank 20 rounds for my hung hem. So that is 20. So now I'm going to look at the stitches that are here at the waste yarn line and pick up the purl bar that is connected to that waste yarn and kind of follow that column up, and then that's where the needle is going to, that's the needle that I'm going to hook it onto. So what I do is I follow my eye down here and I look for the purl bump and then go up the column and then look at the needle that is to the right of that column. That's the needle that I'm going to hang that stitch on. So following it up, I'm going to hang it here. Okay, and then I just continue all along hanging these pearl bumps on the stitches. So I am just about finished hanging the hem of this sock, and so all I need to do is I need to crank forward a little bit so that I can access the stitches that are over here. So I'm just going to hold down on my sock to give it some tension. I'm going to crank forward a little bit. And so I am cranking forward this last row, this last round, with my contrasting yarn. So this is the yarn that's going to sort of close up and bind together all of these stitches. So let me just hang the rest of these stitches here. So that is all my stitches, and so now I just need to crank all the way around, but I'm going to stop at the 6 o'clock mark, and that is where I am going to attach my new color. Okay, so I'm stopping my yarn carrier here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my contrasting color and I'm going to cut my yarn right here at the mast. Get rid of my contrasting yarn, and then with this yarn tail I'm basically going to fold it and put it back into the yarn carrier. Okay, so mine is a slotted yarn carrier, so I can just slide it in here. Okay, so you can see the tail is sort of hanging out here, right there, and then I have a folded loop. I have a folded loop at this side. Okay, so I'm just going to crank forward a little bit, holding on to that loop. So you can see both strands are going to be knit in at the same time. Okay, so we're going to crank forward a couple of stitches to lock it in there. The stitches are locked in. There's 2 strands of yarn here being held together. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my contrasting yarn. This is the new yarn that I'm going to add. So you can see my little loop here that's still hanging out, and I'm going to feed in my other yarn and just pull that through. Okay, and so now you can see that they're joined right here. There's a little bit of a folded loop, so a folded loop of the contrasting yarn and a folded loop of the project yarn, and those two are going to stay together, and I'm going to hold those together as I crank forward some more. So just cranking forward very carefully, making sure that both of those yarns knit together. So now they have cranked forward for a few stitches. I don't need this yarn to crank in for 10 stitches or so many stitches. So I'm just going to pull that through so the tail is hanging on the inside of the sock. And then I'm just going to continue on. So you can see that my join has happened between this point and this point. So this part has folded project yarn, and this part has folded contrasting color yarn. And then I'm going to continue on with the rest of my leg. I'm going to reset the counter. Normally for my socks I'm going to crank 70 rounds, so I'm going to go and crank that forward. And that is 70. And again, I'm going to change now for my contrasting heel. And so again, I'm stopping my yarn carrier here at the 6 o'clock mark. Pop that one out. And I'm going to bring in my contrasting color yarn again. And again, with my project yarn, I am going to fold it so that there's a little bit of a loop on this side. Slide this in. Okay, and I'm going to just crank forward, holding on to both tails at the same time, making sure that gets locked. So there it is, it's locked right here. So now I can add my contrasting color yarn again. And again, now I have my old loop and my new loop. They're folded together, they're clasped together. And just going to crank forward slowly. Now, because I'm about to work the heel, I am going to raise up the stitches in the back of my machine so that these ones are going to come out of work. So normally what I would do is I am going to raise up all the stitches in the back. And so if I'm working with a 64 stitch cylinder, I want to use a little bit more than half for my heel so that I can have a few more extra stitches and make my heel a little bit deeper. This is sometimes called a deep heel. So you can see my 3 o'clock mark is right here, and then I'm going to add 2 more stitches to that side of my heel. And again, this side is my marker, and I'm going to add 2 more stitches to that side of the marker as well. So at the same time, holding my yarns together, 2 strands together, and cranking forward. And we want that little new tail to land on the inside of the sock so that it's not hanging outside of your sock. Okay, so now we're going to raise up this stitch, and we can start going back and forth for the heel. Raise up that needle on that side. So I have just finished cranking and wrapping the 2 target heel stitches. So now I'm going to finish cranking the second half of the short row heel. So when I start changing directions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first lower 2 needles at the same time, and about halfway, not all the way down with all the other needles. I'm doing about halfway and making sure that the latches are going to be open. So that way when I go back across, that these 2 stitches will knit. So I can continue working the heel, just pushing down 1 needle at a time. Okay, so I am about to finish the last wrapped stitches on either side of the heel. Now, when I do that, I typically crank it all the way around. So when I get to this last stitch that's remaining, I will put all of the stitches on the back, all of them down, and I'm going to crank all the way around. I don't want to crank all the way around with my contrasting color because then I'm going to have 1 row, at least 1 row of this darker pink contrast color on the top of my foot, and I don't really want that. So what I need to do is I'm going to stop my yarn carrier here at the 6 o'clock position, and I'm going to change yarns again. I'm going to change back to the original project color. So I'm going to cut my yarn here. And again, I'm going to fold my yarn, put it into the slotted yarn carrier here, and then hold the yarns while I crank forward a little bit, just to lock it in place. I'm just going to feed in my new yarn. So again, I'm folding the 2 together so that I'm looping the new yarn with the old yarn. I'll tuck that back into my slotted yarn carrier here. Okay, now holding the 2 together, I'm going to also now push down all of the stitches in the back. And check all of the latches, making sure that they're all open. Okay, now I can crank forward. Just cranking around really slowly on this first round just to make sure everything is together. And now I've finished the contrasting heel, and what I can do is I'm going to crank the foot now. So I reset my counter. So normally for my socks, I crank 63 rounds around to make a size 7 sock with this particular yarn at this particular gauge. Your number might be more or less for your foot rows, but in my case, I'm going to do 63 foot rows. What I'll do is I'll crank 60 rounds with the project yarn, and then I'll switch back to the contrasting color, and I'll do that for 3 rounds before then starting the toe. Okay, that is 60. I'm going to change colors now. I'm cutting off my project yarn. I'm going to make that little loop here. Again, looking for my loop here, feeding in my new yarn. You can see the two of them joined right there. Okay, and that is 63. So now for my toe, I'm going to pick up the back half of all of my needles. I'm going to go ahead and crank the toe with the contrasting yarn now. To take this off. And already I can see that my stitches are starting to ride up, so I need to move my heel forks up. Okay, and this is my very last round. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to cut my tail, give it a big, nice long tail. So this is what I'm going to use for grafting. So I'm going to put all the needles back down, back into work, and just checking that all of the latches are open so that I don't drop any stitches now at the very end. And I'm going to crank forward until I get to the corner of where the toe meets the sock. So that is my 3 o'clock position. I pull my cut yarn right through there. And then I'm going to attach my waste yarn back in here. And making sure that it sort of wraps around needle number 1, again where my marker is. So if your latches are not all open when you crank around, you will probably drop a stitch, just like this, but I'm just latching it back up, and I'll put it back onto the needle. It's ready to go. Just cranking around slowly just to make sure that you've caught everything. You can go ahead and crank in your waste yarn. There is your sock. So there you have it. Using the main color yarn that we were using today, this is a Tough Love sock in lightning rod with a contrasting color, contrasting mini skein, and using that to crank together to make a sock that has a contrasting short row heel, contrasting short row toe, which we can graft up later using a tutorial that I've shown on how to graft and close a toe of a CSM sock. And I also did a hung hem with contrasting color as well. And so the benefit of using this technique of doing the faux Russian join, where you basically take these two yarns and you clasp them together in a clasped weft sort of format, that allows you to crank the sock and you don't have to weave in any ends at the end. So that is the heel. It's nicely formed. There's no gap in here, there's no hole in here or anything like that, and there's nothing to join at the end. There's no ends to weave in. Everything looks great. You can see where the join actually happened is right there. Some of the yarn is doubled up in here. So there will be a couple of spots where the yarn is doubled up in the knitting, but it doesn't feel like much. It doesn't feel that much denser or thicker than the rest of the fabric. So you just have to be really careful in those spots where you crank these two strands of yarn in at the same time, because you're effectively making a thicker yarn and it can cause some problems with your machine. Here's the join that happened with the toe. You can barely tell. Feels a tiny bit thicker here where the yarn is doubled up, but not that much. And you can see the tail end hanging out on the inside of the sock. And so you can just trim these ends so they're very close to the inside, but you don't want to trim them so close that they end up falling to the outside of the sock. So there it is, nothing to weave in, no ends to weave in at the end of this, and you can just graft the toe closed. This is the same joining technique that you can use if you're wanting to make something like a scrap sock. Using up all leftover scraps of sock yarn, you could crank 3 rounds of one, join to the next scrap, 3 rounds of another one, join onto the next scrap, and you can just use this technique to join on all your yarns to make a scrappy sock, and that way you don't actually have to weave in any ends at the end. If you have long tails on the inside of your sock, you can just trim them at the end of the day, and then you can have a nice scrappy sock. But this is a super fun way to incorporate a little bit of extra color. The first sock that I cranked that was just one color was also really fun, but having these pops of color for the heels and the toes are extra nice. So thank you so much for being with me today to crank another sock on the circular sock knitting machine. If you like these kinds of videos, please do subscribe. I make quite a number of circular sock knitting machine videos, and I love using this machine. If you want to find us online, we are at SweetGeorgiaYarns.com, and we have this monthly ongoing Secret Stash yarn subscription box. So every month you can open a box with all new different colors, yarns, textures, all for knitting socks or using fingering weight yarn. So we would love to have you join us there. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. All right, bye for now.